Okay, it's 1:15. I know people sometimes take a little bit longer to put in the correct details, etc., to join. So I might just give it a little bit longer. I guess I'll start just by introducing myself. If you want to turn off the image of me, which appears to be doing the fast forward hokey cokey or something, feel free to. I think you can do that within your own Zoom settings, and you can just focus on the desktop screen that I'm sharing with you. This is the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be going through, followed by a quick look at one of our own in-house report templates and how to fill it in. So I'm an ecologist at the Ecology Co-op, a principal consultant, and I've been working as an ecologist for about 15 years. And I have to, as part of my job, write and review hundreds of reports a year, probably. So perhaps that's hopefully given me enough experience to put together this presentation. I've done my best to try and make it as sort of user-friendly for everyone, but there's going to be people with different levels of experience. I think looking at the people that have signed up, there's a range from undergraduates right the way up to principal ecologists. So I can't obviously cater the presentation to everyone, but I've done my best. We'll see. Hopefully it's useful to you. Let's just see where we're up to with attendees. We're up to 70 people. I think that's leveled off. We're a couple of minutes in, so I'll get started. Okay, so this is what we're going to be going through in this presentation. The purpose of ecology reports and who is reading them, the different types of reports and their purpose, the structure of reports, how they're set out, appropriate methods of assessment, tips to making a report look professional, some examples of good and bad text that hopefully you'll find useful, and then of course I said we'll look at one of our own report templates. So who are our reports for? First and foremost, most importantly, they're for our clients. They are, of course, paying for them. But importantly, the document forms legal and planning advice that they will need to follow. You will need to make very clear to your clients what legal commitments they may have as part of their development. Of course, the planning authority is going to be considering your reports as well. It might be the council's ecologist. Sometimes it is just the council's case officer. And of course, there are government bodies that also may be consulted. Natural England, the Environment Agency. Certainly, if your development proposal is likely to impact, let's say, a statutory designated site like a SSSI, then Natural England will be assessing impacts within your document. And of course, members of the public, which just highlights why it's important to make sure that your report is user-friendly to anyone of any level of understanding, but of course that the public can include anyone. So types of reports that are commonly used in consultancy, let's just take a quick look at those. What we commonly refer to as phase 1 reports, not to be confused with phase 1 habitat surveys, although that does form part of a phase 1 assessment. The most commonly produced reports here are your preliminary ecological appraisals, or PEAs, and your bat scoping assessment reports. I'll also discuss the sort of letter report a little bit later. Your phase 2 surveys are your more detailed protected and notable species surveys and habitat surveys that you'll have identified as a result of your phase 1 assessment. And subsequently, you've got your impact assessments, which pulls together the information you've gathered from your phase 1 and phase 2 surveys and considers them according to the ecological impact assessment guidelines produced by SIGN, for example, or according to the habitat regulations assessment, which we'll touch on very briefly later. And finally, what I tend to refer to as phase 3. This is your mitigation statements and enhancement plans, such as a landscape and ecology management plan or habitat creation management plan, which basically takes the information from your impact assessment where you've identified the species and habitats that are going to be affected by proposal and details how they'll be conserved and protected through a development. So we'll just go through and look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So phase one reports start out with a preliminary ecological appraisal. The approach to these changed a little bit a few years ago when SIAM brought out their 2007 guidance. Prior to 2007, myself and many others would perhaps have produced PEA reports quite commonly to support their project. But it was decided by SIAM subsequently that it would be split out into an ECIA if you had a site where protected species surveys were required and an impact assessment is necessary. But they're conducted according to, like I said, the 2017 guidelines, and they're typically used to inform your client of the potential for a development proposal to have certain protected species constraints, identify habitat impacts, etc. They are primarily to inform your client and not typically used to be provided to a planning authority. Your bat scoping assessment is conducted according to Bat Conservation Trust guidelines. Most recent version of those is 2016, and I think there's new guidelines due to come out perhaps later this year. And they present the results of scoping assessment focusing on bats solely. You may, of course, produce a report that combines a bat scoping assessment with a PEA. But yes, it's undertaken according to a slightly different set of guidelines produced by the BCT. You'll need to include well-labeled figures to support your descriptions. A picture paints 1,000 words, obviously. And results from things like DNA analysis will need to be detailed here. A letter report, we don't tend to use very often, but in some instances can be useful if you have a proposal which is incredibly simple and poses a negligible impact risk to wildlife and protected species. So as an example, someone is building a garage in their back garden, it's going on top of a patio, you can't find any ponds nearby. The council's requested a report, but you need to write in to confirm that you've identified that the proposal does not pose any impact risk. It might also be where you are, sorry, jump ahead there. It might also be where you have perhaps surveyed a site 2 years previously and you are just writing to confirm that there has been no significant changes to your previous findings. So your phase two reports follow on from your initial assessment, your phase one, and as I've already said, are often absorbed into an ECIA, but may form standalone reports or be absorbed into what's called a holding document. Incorporates all the data from a variety of surveys. It could be bats, dormice, great-crested newts, etc. And you might within them detail some outline mitigation and avoidance measures that are necessary. But typically, a detailed mitigation statement would be produced as a separate document. That's the phase three that I mentioned earlier. So it can just be, as I said, individual species or habitat reports that are produced as a standalone document, and it might not always necessarily be for planning purposes. As an example, we've done a recent piece of work for Natural England, which is just assessing one of their designated sites. So impact assessments, which are pulling together the information you've gathered from your phase one and phase two reports. Your ECIA, which is conducted according to the SIAM guidance, already mentioned, and is completed only after all of your survey information has been compiled and completed and analysed. It forms a detailed assessment of all species and habitats constraints further to those surveys. I put an illustration on the right of what we actually call this report, because we don't title it an ecological impact assessment. We call it just an ecological assessment report. The reason being is that within the ECIA guidelines, they've been produced to cover ideally everything from a very small development right the way up to a new power station over 250 hectares with huge numbers of impacts. And the detail required within that means that you are potentially looking at positive or negative effects, the extent, magnitude, duration, frequency and timing, reversibility of any impacts identified. Now, if you are looking at a really small development proposal of, let's say, an extension to a house or a new dwelling, some of that really isn't detail that you're going to need to consider. So whilst we do incorporate the ECIA guidelines, we're not following to the full extent. And for that reason, we decided to title our reports Ecological Assessment. Finally, the HRA, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but it is production of either an appropriate assessment or screening report, which assesses the potential for a proposal to impact upon SPAs and SACs, which are Natura 2000 sites, typically within 5 kilometres, but can be a much further distance radius from a development proposal. That can change because it is down to the planning authority to determine when they feel the need for that report is triggered. And the furthest we've had so far is actually 22 kilometres, I think, which was a little bit crazy. But if you deal with Wilden Council, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Right, phase 3, finally, our other reports, our mitigation statements and our enhancement plans. Once you've been through the phase 1 and phase 2 process, you've identified all of your impacts, you need to set out how you are going to protect, preserve, and enhance where possible habitat features, protected species populations. And these are what I tend to refer to as our phase 3 documents. They can come by a few different names. A mitigation statement is typically a document that is focusing on a particular species, so it might be written for bats or for badgers or for dormice. A habitat creation and management plan or a landscape and ecology management plan is typically produced as a document that is going to set out enhancements that you can incorporate into retained green space, for example, within a residential development. Some examples there of particular features include wildflower meadows, high binoculars, ponds, bat and bird boxes, bee banks. You can be as creative if you like. They're one of my favourite reports to write, I'd say. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to set out 4 examples of projects and how to select the right report for the project. So in our first example, we're starting small. This is a client who wants to build a 2-storey extension onto their property, and they've been notified by the planning authority that they need a biodiversity survey, and that is what we so often get requested by planning authorities. They never give much detail. They just say biodiversity survey, regardless of the size or scale or potential impact of a proposal. But you interpret it because it is a proposal that's clearly going to impact roosting, or has the potential, sorry, to impact roosting bats, either within the roof void or crevices associated with roof tiles or the eaves of the property, let's say. But of course, there's a possibility of impacting other species too. So there could be house sparrows, there could be house martins, or there might be that they've decided to put that extension right on top of a pond that's got good potential for great crested newts. You never know. It does happen. So what do we want to proceed with? A full-scale ECIA for this small proposal, which isn't likely to have a significant effect on species other than bats and possibly nesting birds. We're going to proceed with a bat scooping assessment conducted according to BCT guidelines and incorporating a preliminary ecological appraisal, so you can demonstrate that you've considered potential impact on other protected species. And as a guide, I've just said, for a proposal like this, we'd probably have a budget of about 7 hours for completing the desktop assessment and writing the subsequent report. So here's example 2. We've gone a bit bigger scale here. We've got a client that wishes to explore the potential constraints to a proposed residential development upon a 10-hectare greenfield site. There are no development plans yet available. This is often obviously the first stage in which clients might be looking at a possible development, and they're trying to understand the feasibility of that development. They've made it clear that they don't have further proposals or any particular details. So it's important though that they can understand the potential constraints moving forward. So a preliminary ecological appraisal is going to be the right document because it will set out to them what we see as the possible constraints, the further surveys that would be required moving forward. It could also include a possible scope for enhancements. We might identify a part of the site. So my dog's going nuts, chasing his tail. It might also include a part of the site which could be enhanced for improvement to, say, species-rich grassland, which could be valuable in planning terms moving forwards. For a project like this, I've suggested perhaps a budget of 10 to 12 hours because it should be a pretty simple document. You are not going into the level of detail seen in an ECIA where you're trying to draw conclusions on what you found. You obviously can't, you haven't completed the further surveys. Example 3, so this is one where another consultancy has approached us and they've asked us if we can undertake surveys of a proposed quarry site, which they require assistance for, if we can cover specifically bat activity, breeding bird and great crested newt surveys. They've specified the methods they want us to follow and they've asked for detailed results and some analysis of the findings. They might well do that because they lack some of the context, having not been the surveyors on the ground during the surveys. So the scope's been clearly defined. It's clear that a detailed impact assessment isn't required. And what I would propose we produce here is what's called a holding document, which details the protected species surveys we've undertaken and sets out our results and, as they've requested, a discussion of them. A project like that, I've given it a typical budget perhaps of 15+ hours, but that would depend a little bit on the scope of the surveys requested by the client and how much of a discussion they wanted. So finally, example 4, we've got something more detailed here. Let's assume that this client is in possession of land that is being allocated within a local plan. So they've got a plan for construction of 70 new homes on an allocated site. They've got a detailed site development plan that we can look at. It might be that obviously it's subject to minor changes according to what we found. If it hasn't been surveyed previously, certainly we might find features that we say, look, you've got to avoid that tree. It's got a nice big bat roost in it. It's looking, it's not going to look bad if you, it's going to look bad if you fell that tree when you quite easily could just change the footprint of the development slightly. And we're not going to produce a PEA in this instance because there's not the need to spend the time producing the separate document. We can highlight directly to the client within an email all of our findings and set out the further surveys that are required. But the data can simply, from our initial assessment, be kept and used for input into the ECI moving forwards. So whilst an initial initial survey incorporating a PEA and habitat map will be required to set out the scope of further surveys, the document that we'll be moving forward with is an ECIA, whilst obviously there's potential for further what we call phase 3 reports moving forward. So, okay, with that covered, I'm going to set out a little bit the structure of a report, important rules and guides to completing them. This is the kind of scientific process that most of you should be familiar with. I'm guessing that most of you either are have completed a BSc or are in the process of completing one. So the process of an introduction, methodology, results, discussion, recommendations, and conclusions should be kind of familiar to you. It's a common theme for most consultancies to follow that process. I have seen slight variations of it, but it's important to follow. The summary is actually possibly the most important part of your report. It pains me to say it, but it's quite possible that the majority of people that read your report won't go much further than the summary. Some consultants I've seen don't actually include a summary to avoid that risk and make sure that their reports are read in full, but they are incredibly useful. They do help direct people to the right place and the most relevant information without taking up too much time. But they must be both concise and include the most important information that you're trying to convey. So ensure that your summary includes the most important results. So have you found great crested newts, dormice? What is the population you've identified? What are the implications to the development? What are the next steps? Are further surveys required? Have those surveys been completed? And is there mitigation that you can specify? So make sure that the summary is well detailed. Templates will be slightly different and can be edited easily to ensure they work to your project. Quite often there will be certain elements of the section that just don't quite fit, but can be changed as necessary. And make sure that the sections are well defined. So quite often when I review reports, I'll find that within the results, people have just started to drift into sort of discussion and recommendations of those results. But that really belongs to the section below. Within results, you are literally stating what you have found There is no interpretation included within that section. Okay, and just to sort of break it down a bit further, I've included a copy of a contents page. This is taken from one of our BAT scoping report templates. You'll see within this that the headings that I kind of alluded to earlier are broken down a bit further into subheadings that help prompt you to fill in the right information. So if I take the results in as an example, within it, you've got the desk study and a search for granted EPS licenses. We do a search within 1 kilometre of our site to see what previous EPS licenses have been granted near a project. Providing site context and describing the surrounding habitats. The building inspection is broken down into an assessment for roosting potential and hibernation potential, and of course, looking for potential for other protected or notable species. So what I've come with here is some tips to creating a report that looks professional. It's going to be really important if you already work for a consultancy or if you're looking to work for a consultancy in the future, to make sure that you stick true to their report style and that is maintained throughout. You'll find that the headers font and the justification, that is, as our reports will have justified text, some go for sort of left indent, etc. But within all of our documents, it is the same because it is kind of the identity of your company. So make sure you don't deviate from the report templates unless absolutely necessary. Quite often I'll see where people have inserted text they might have copied and pasted from elsewhere, and that can cause problems with the formatting. So just make sure that you correct that if it happens. The front page is the first thing that someone who reads your report is going to see. So if you make an error there, you're instantly off on the wrong foot. Just make sure that you spelt the site name correctly, that you filled in your name and your accreditations correctly, the spacing is appropriate, etc. Don't start off on the wrong foot and make sure that the front page is correct. I like all of our photographs and figures to have an outline. You'll find that particularly photographs where, say, you've got white clouds, you know, at the top of the picture, it just bleeds into the white background of the page, and they're just not well defined. So make sure that there's a 0.75 black line around the boundary of photographs. That certainly is true for our templates. It might be separate for your companies, of course. And with your maps and indeed your photographs, make sure that the focus of what you're looking at is central to the image. You don't want your site to be down the bottom left side of the picture. I can understand why sometimes people do it. It's because they've kind of moved the image to include, say, a feature of interest like a river or an ancient woodland. But just zoom out if you need to. Just move the map, zoom the map out a little bit to include it, or indeed include two site plans, one that is cropped and one that is more zoomed out to include what you're looking at. Remember, our reports are being read by Joe Blogs, people who will not understand what a GCN is or what a triple SI is. So make sure you've explained what they are. Once you have, you of course can stick with your technical descriptions or acronyms as necessary, but explain them once clearly and then carry on as necessary. Make sure you include references to all guidance and legislation as necessary. They should already be included 99% of the time within the report templates, but there might be an instance where perhaps you're including specific guidance that we rarely ever use, perhaps for a certain type of invertebrate survey or something like that. So make sure it's referenced. We put our references into the footers. Okay, so here's an example that I've just explained. Figures and photographs that don't quite look right. You'll see the example on the left. The focus of the site just isn't quite central to the image. And if we assume this is for like a BAT scoping assessment where 3 buildings are being surveyed, you want to make sure that those buildings are perhaps visible within the red line plan. So on the example on the right, you can see that the site's been centralized and it's been cropped to make sure that those buildings are clearly visible. It's perhaps not quite as visible on this figure, that the image on the right has got a black outline, but it does help it to sit out from the page slightly. So some general tips in text, writing a report. Avoid removing conjunctions. These are words that link sentences such as for, but, and, yet, and so. It might seem really obvious, and I'm sure most of you probably don't do this, but in an age when we are all writing things hurriedly on WhatsApp and on social media, etc., it's all too common for errors to creep in because people just you know, go off the cuff, don't they? They just reduce sentences and speed them up. Use descriptive captions for photographs and avoid oversimplifying them. A bad example here, field A with improved pasture. It's just too simplistic. Consider the alternative, a view looking southwards across field A, which is formed of improved pasture and bordered by hawthorn hedgerows. You provided an extra bit of added context there. You said that you described where the photograph's been taken from, and your description's a little bit more accurate. Use an appendix for photographs and figures if there's going to be a lot of them. I'd probably try and limit it to about 3 pages. I know some consultancies actually automatically just put all of their photographs and figures and many of their figures into an appendix anyway. We avoid that if we can because we just find that to have to scroll all the way to the bottom of a report and back up again when you want to check against something that's been described in the text of the report is a bit of a pain. But you don't want pages and pages of photographs either. So try and limit it to 3. You can reduce the size of photographs, of course, and have perhaps 2 photographs side by side. You can get up to 6 onto a single page. That gives you lots of room. Avoid big chunks of text for captions to support diagrams, figures, and tables. If you are putting lots of text to support a diagram or a figure, you're probably going too far into a detailed description analysis that probably just belongs in the body of the report. So just keep it concise. This is a pet hate of mine. I call it carryover, but it's basically where the bottom of a descriptive bit of text, say to a photograph or a figure, just drops over into the next page. Worse still, it might be that you've got a page break after that. So what you are left with is just a few words and then a whole blank page. And of course, we live in an age when we're trying to cut down on printing as much as possible. Someone somewhere is probably going to be printing this. And if you can just knock that line or those few words up into the page above, perhaps by cropping the photograph slightly, whatever, just do that. And be really transparent about how you draw your conclusions and your reasoning. It's probably the most likely reason that you are going to get a county ecologist contacting you, asking questions because they've just not quite understood exactly why you've come to a certain conclusion. Just make sure that you've been really clear. You believe that the site is unsuitable for great crested newts and that the pond 150 metres to the west is not a material consideration because set out clearly the barriers to movement, the habitat value, the context of the surrounding landscape. Just make sure you've been really clear. Some continued tips, right? So make sure you state very clearly the limitation to any survey effort. At the moment, obviously with coronavirus, that's pretty common, isn't it? That we can't perhaps access a roof void because someone inside is shielding and you can't socially distance to get into a roof void and complete your assessment. Just be very clear of any limitations and why that limitation existed. It might be that a site is really hard to access. I've been on sites before that are just an absolute jungle of bramble and you can't get through the whole thing. Make sure that you've got good continuity throughout. If you start off saying, okay, the main house is referred to as building 1, the barn is building 2, make sure you stick with building 1 and building 2 throughout the rest of the document. Try not to switch back to the barn, to the house. Make sure that you stick with whatever label you come up with. And avoid repeating the same word within a sentence or a paragraph. This just doesn't sound good. The most common ones are the words building and site, which just keep coming up repeatedly, sometimes 3-4 times in the same paragraph or sentence. Once you've used scientific names, make sure that you then switch to just using the common names. So, for example, there, alder, Alder glutinosa. Once you've labelled it once, just refer to order from thereafter. We don't use a capital for a common name. I know some people do, but I don't think it's best practice. And make sure that you're consistent with that. The exception will be, of course, where you've got species that are named after a person or a place, like Dartford warbler or Benton's bat. And importantly, make sure you reread everything. That doesn't just mean rereading the sentence or the paragraph you've just written, but once you've completed your report, go back to the very beginning, maybe even put the report to one side for a little while, so it's not too fresh, and come back to it and read it from start to finish. That way you'll see how the report flows, and you'll also be able to identify where you might have repeated yourself. So I've written in some good and bad text examples, just to illustrate a couple of the previous points covered to you. So consider this paragraph. The building is brick built with handmade clay roof tiles upon a simple gable roof. The eastern gable wall of the building is clad with handmade clay tiles, whilst the western gable wall of the building is clad with loose-fitting timber weatherboarding. It lacks a bit of detail, and you can see the word building cropping up there 3 times. Once you've set the subject matter of the paragraph, which is the building, you don't really need to keep repeating the building. So consider the second paragraph, which also includes better descriptions. The building is brick built with a simple gable roof that is clad in handmade clay tiles, featuring numerous gaps between tiles that could be exploited by small bats such as the pipistrelle species. The eastern gable wall is also clad with similar handmade clay tiles featuring such gaps, whilst the western gable end is clad with timber weatherboarding that includes at least 3 gaps between boards that could be exploited by a variety of bat species. You've got some more detailed descriptions, and some of that repetition has been reduced. And details. Don't be lazy with your descriptions. Make sure that you are being thorough. Here's an example of a bad description, a bad site description. The site is bordered to the east by a species poor hedgerow, whilst tree lines form the northern and western boundaries. It might be perfectly accurate, but it is a very simple description of a site. Let's consider an alternative here. The eastern boundary of the site is bordered by a species-poor box-shaped mature hawthorn hedgerow that is managed to a height of approximately 2 metres. Along the northern and western boundaries of the site is bounded by tree lines comprising of a mixture of mature oak with some semi-mature sycamore saplings. So the context is being better set there. You've included a description of the character of the hedgerow and the maturity of the trees forming the tree lines. That will help when you're further down the report, you're discussing about potential impacts to bats and other species. Right, that comes to the end of the PowerPoint presentation, but the show is not quite over. You're in luck. Let me just find the template I'm going to take you through. So what I'll do now is just go through one of the Ecology Co-op's report templates and how you would go about filling this in. So you'll see there's a lot of bright green and yellow highlighting, pretty garish, you can't miss it. There's a reason why it's so ugly. It means that you're not going to miss it when you come to do a review. And as I scroll through, you will also see some sections here that are in blue. So I'll just explain what that means. Green text is a prompt. I'm obviously being very specific to Ecology Co-op report templates here. It might be very different for your consultancy or one that you might work for in the future, but this is just how we've decided to do things. We've highlighted everything in green that is a prompt. You are to infill text in this section. It might provide an instruction. And text in yellow is example text that might be usable. You could be really lucky. You're filling out this template on the 26th of February. Easy, unhighlight, done. But it's most likely that you're going to need to change it, adding in the report project number as an example. So what I'm going to do is find a section that I can fill in, and I'll explain how we do that process. So let's assume that we've done a survey at a site, and I'm filling in the section for badgers. It was the back garden. We couldn't find any signs of badgers anywhere. We did our best to look for a search of only 30 meters of the garden and didn't see anything. There's some example text here, which I can probably adopt into my report. So you'll see the prompt, add description of the survey results. Let's remove that. Does the prompt match, does the, the example text match the description of my site? So no signs of any badger activity during the survey assessment, but there are habitats of value for this species within the site and surrounding landscape. Right, I might need to change that because actually there wasn't any suitable habitats within the context of the site because it was a residential property right in the middle of Croydon. There was a high concrete wall around the garden, let's say. No, it's not appropriate, so I'll just need to delete that text and edit it and change as necessary. Further down, you'll see there are further prompts. So add limitation survey in section 3.12. So let's assume that perhaps I couldn't get a view at a neighbouring garden that might have had suitability for badgers. I might need to state an access constraint there. And of course, if we're completing a biodiversity record search, which we should be for most of our projects, we'll be adding in any records, but of course, you're not always adding in badger records because they might be sensitive. So you've got an option there, completing either or. Okay, I think that probably covers the basics for completing our template, and it covers the basics for this presentation. What I'm going to try and do is get out of screen share if I can. Ooh. Can I even learn how to share? Oh, stop share. There we go. Right, and I've got some text up. So what I was going to suggest is if anyone has any questions they want to ask about the presentation and about report writing, what I will do is do a quick Q&A for 10 minutes or so. So if you want to type into the chat any questions you've got, I'll be happy to discuss them further. I see that someone's asked if they can have access to the PowerPoint after the call. Yeah, I'm happy to post up this presentation. I think the plan is to try and put it onto YouTube. So if you want, just check out for the link, and of course you can watch the PowerPoint presentation on YouTube later. Okay, the date on the title page of the report. It's a good question. So on the title page, yes, you've seen the date on the top. That is the date that we submit the report to the client. Make sure that you've obviously stated within the body of the report the date that you've perhaps undertaken your assessment or repeated visits, but the date on the front page should be the date of submission. And I tend to stick with that date rigidly after the first submission. So even if there are subsequent revisions, perhaps because the site plan has changed, I'll often stick with the original date that it was completed, because quite often the planning authority will look at the date on the front and consider the age of the report in that context. And there might have been a year has gone by since the revision to the report, and the site plans might have changed. So I don't want to update my report with a fresh new date. I'll probably stick with the old one and just note that there's been a modification to the report. Okay. Will each report be available for a consultancy as in the layout that you showed? Different consultancies will have different layouts to their reports. The structures should be broadly similar, but I have seen some fairly significant differences. Some people like to produce reports that are set out in a landscape orientation, for example. I've seen that some like to break down their methodology results and discussion per species or group within a report, rather than putting them each in separate sections. So there are more than one way to do it. If sensitive species records are found, how would you report these if not included in the report? If you found sensitive species records, then you will be detailing them in the report if they're, of course, relevant. If you've undertaken, for some reason, a broader biodiversity record search for a really small proposal, and you've got records coming in for wetland birds that are based upon a nature reserve 2 kilometres away, it might not be relevant to include them. But certainly, if they are of any relevance to your report or to your development, then they must be detailed. Okay, does it happen that someone might have requested a certain report to be written, but you might think another would be more suitable? Yes, yeah, absolutely. Quite often we'll be asked to undertake a bat scoping assessment. We just want you to look at bats because we're demolishing this building and we're building a new one. We have to point out to them, actually, look, there's a pond 20 metres to the east of your site. We're going to need to consider great risk of needs. The new footprint of the development is on some taller grassland, and we just have to gently try and steer them over towards a more detailed approach and explain to them we need to produce something following our ESIA format that I already mentioned. Okay. Where a license will be required, how many times do you state this? I put it in the summary, discussion, conclusion, but I've had a few clients saying they didn't realize. You can't help stupid clients, guys, unfortunately. If you put it in your summary at the top of the report and you put it into your discussion and conclusion, you've been as clear as you can be within a report document. But what I would say is that you've got to account for clients that are lazy and might not read your report at all, not even the summary. Make sure that in your email back to them, you're making clear what their commitments are. Just accompany the report, a quick summary within the body of the email that they're much more likely to read. Make clear your findings and their commitments according to the protected species that you've found. Okay, another question. Do I ever just say, no, it isn't possible to build there? Yes, it does happen. Now, there are obviously, the presence of protected species doesn't always preclude a development because there are, such a wide variety of mitigation measures, enhancements, etc., that you can incorporate into a proposal that it's always possible that you can work around a development. But yes, we've had instances where the scale of the impact is just unacceptable. And we've had to advise them that from the offset. We don't like to just say no to people straight away without having looked at a site in more detail. We have been provided site plans and we looked at it a bit closer, and it's in an ancient woodland. We'll just have to say from the offset, look, this is completely against policy. Your chances of getting a development here are slim to none, more likely none. And we're honest to them. But if they're insistent that they want us to proceed with an assessment of that site, of course we will do it. And we'll state everything we've said previously within the report, citing the fact that it would be against policy, citing the magnitude of the impact. And of course, it's down to the responsibility of the council to pick up on that and reject such an application accordingly. Okay, do we tend to have the person undertaking the field work also write the report? Yes. If possible, it's obviously best because they have the context. We can often sometimes where perhaps someone is a little overloaded with work, they can pass over their notes and ask someone else to produce the write-up. Sometimes the desktop assessment, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be produced by someone who's visiting the site. It can help in the context, but yes, you can kind of share workloads in that way, and it's not absolutely essential for the person to have undertaken the site visit to have written the report. Okay, I think I'm at the end of the questions. I haven't seen any more pop up, and I've hit 45 minutes. Oh, hang on. How about if planning don't pick it up, or if they don't ask for an assessment at all? Yeah, that happens obviously as well. Some councils are worse than others, and you will get instances where planning is approved and there aren't the appropriate conditions necessary for protected species, or they haven't read your report at all. Legal commitments, however, override planning consent. You have to make that clear to your client. Hopefully they have come back to you and said, oh, look, planning didn't actually make any conditions, provide us with any conditions relating to ecology, even though you found dormice on the site. But you have to work around that. You can flag it up to the planning authority. They have done that in the past. Speaking to the Ecology council's ecologists can help. Sometimes perhaps they've been missed, haven't been consulted, and they will just provide the appropriate feedback to the case officer. Do I ever invite the client out to site to take part in the initial assessment as a way of getting the message across? Sometimes I wouldn't necessarily automatically ask that. Quite often clients want to meet us on site anyway, just to discuss a proposal. It gives us a better understanding of the nature of the development. The most likely reason that we'd want to invite the client out to the site is if they are perhaps failed to understand our impact assessment or our findings, and perhaps we need to meet them on site to provide them with the appropriate context. How easy to write these reports if you haven't written one before? It's going to be different for different people. I'm sure some people pick this up very quickly and easily. For others, perhaps it takes a little bit more time. I'm trying to think back to the first report I wrote, but it's so long ago I can remember what it would have been. I think it's not too difficult. If you've got a good template you're working from, and you've got a supportive senior team, working with you, providing you with guidance, an example report, one that's already been produced to read through first and compare and look alongside, the report you're producing will obviously always help. Hopefully that advice is useful. Okay, I think I've probably come to the end now. I was sort of giving a little bit more time there for a few more questions, but thank you all very much for joining. I'll call it to a close now. If you do want to keep popping up any future questions, perhaps if you do want to send me an email. In fact, I'm open to invites to other trainings. Can't promise I'll have time to put other trainings together. We are starting to get a bit busy over here, but if there's a certain element of training you really want covered, give me a pointer, drop me an email. Thank you very much for your time, and maybe see you soon. See you.